Duncan Rael trusted three things: his body's ability to read a room for threats, the Glock 23 he kept taped beneath the lip of his nightstand, and the absolute certainty that Zeus, a 1,700-pound quarter-horse stallion with a documented history of putting people in the hospital, would never willingly let a stranger near his face. So when the quiet woman his brother had hired to manage the stable walked into the barn at midnight during a Texas thunderstorm and pressed her palm flat against the bridge of Zeus's nose, and the horse dropped his enormous head and breathed out in a long, shuddering exhale of relief, Duncan understood something with cold, immediate clarity. Whatever had followed him out of Mexico wasn't waiting outside the fence line anymore. It was already in his barn. 6 months earlier, a joint DHS-DEA fugitive interdiction operation in the Sierra Madre Occidental had gone catastrophically wrong. Duncan had spent 11 years as a supervisory special agent on the Southwest Border Fugitive Task Force, the unit responsible for hunting cartel leadership with outstanding federal warrants. He had walked point on 43 high-risk arrests. He had never lost an agent. The Vasquez-Lorca operation changed that. The intelligence package that put his team on a rural compound 40 miles south of Chihuahua City had been pristine. Too pristine. They had moved on it fast. 3 vehicles, 8 agents, 1 translator, and walked straight into a prepared ambush. The cartel had known the exact route, the timing, the radio channels. Someone had sold them the playbook. Duncan took a round through the left hip that shattered his iliac crest and nicked the femoral nerve. His translator, a 29-year-old woman named Priscilla Ayers, was shot twice in the chest. He held her hand until the medevac arrived. She didn't make it. 2 other agents sustained critical wounds that ended their careers on operating tables. Duncan survived, technically. The orthopedic reconstruction required 11 hours of surgery and 2 titanium plates. Chronic nerve damage left his left leg dragging when he was tired. The tinnitus from a flashbang the ambush team had rolled in was constant, a high-pitched whine that lived behind his right ear like a tenant who had stopped paying rent. A subsequent CT scan flagged a subdural hematoma that a neurologist described as minor, as if minor and brain were words that belonged in the same sentence. He was 38 months away from full federal pension. His brother Brendan had offered the cattle ranch near Kerrville as a place to convalesce. Quiet Texas Hill country, cedar and limestone, a property their grandfather had worked. Duncan had no intention of convalescing. He intended to get mobile again, identify who had sold his team out, and make that fact known to the people in Washington with the authority to do something permanent about it. In the meantime, there was the ranch. And there was Zeus. Zeus was a 17-year-old AQHA stallion, copper red with a pale blaze, 17 hands of pure muscle and acquired grievance. He had once been a mounted patrol horse for the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Unit out of Del Rio. A training accident had left him with physical scars along his hindquarters, and something that looked, in animal terms, a great deal like PTSD. He would tolerate Duncan. He would tolerate Brendan at arm's length. He had put 2 hired stable hands in the hospital over the past year. A 22-year-old kid who'd reached for his halter too quickly, and a retired farrier who had walked into the wrong stall on the wrong morning. As the security system went, Zeus was more effective than the motion sensor cameras mounted along the fence line. When Duncan's injury made it impossible to manage the barn work himself, the hip wouldn't bend far enough to haul water buckets, the nerve damage made ladders a liability. Brendan hired through an agency out of San Antonio that specialized in placing experienced ranch workers with private properties. The first 2 candidates quit inside of a week. Zeus made that decision easy for them. The third arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in a 10-year-old Ford Ranger, the color of old clay. Her name was Sage Alcott. 29, according to the employment file. 5'4", lean in the way of someone who moved constantly rather than worked out. Dark brown hair in a low practical knot. She wore faded canvas work pants, a plain gray long sleeve, and boots that had actual wear on them, which Duncan registered immediately. People who bought boots for impression wore the wear in different places. She shook Brendan's hand at the gate, then walked directly to the barn without being told where it was. Duncan watched from the kitchen window. He expected the usual sequence. Stranger approaches the stall. Zeus pins his ears. Zeus swings his head and bares his teeth. Stranger retreats. Simple. Sage Alcott walked to Zeus's stall, stopped 6 feet from the gate, and stood still. Not frozen. Still, in the deliberate way of someone doing something intentional with their body. Breathing a certain way, holding their weight with purpose. Not performing calm, but achieving it. Zeus's ears swiveled forward instead of flat. The horse took 1 step toward the gate, then another. He stopped with his nose 6 inches from Sage's shoulder, nostrils working. She hadn't moved her hands. After 40 seconds, she reached up slowly and scratched the base of his jaw. Zeus leaned into it like a dog. Duncan set his coffee cup down on the counter. She didn't look like much. That was the thing he kept turning over during the first 2 weeks. Efficient without being impressive about it. She mucked stalls on a schedule, managed Zeus's feed adjustments without being asked, and replaced a rotted fence post in the west pasture on her 3rd day that Brendan's regular handyman had been deferring for a month. She arrived at 7 and left at 4. She didn't use her phone often, and on the 2 occasions Duncan observed her making a call, she stepped away from the barn first and walked to the far side of the paddock, which might have meant privacy, and might have meant something else entirely. She never startled. That was what began pulling at the edge of Duncan's attention. Ranch work produced a constant ambient noise. The creak of corrugated roofing in the wind, the sudden hydraulic moan of the old well pump, Zeus kicking his water bucket when he was bored. Those sounds made people flinch. They pulled your attention involuntarily, even when you knew what you were hearing. Brendan did it. Duncan did it. Sage Alcott never did. When a cedar plank dropped off the sawhorse and hit the ground with a crack like a .22 discharge, her head turned toward it without surprise. Not what was that? More like cataloging it, filing it as non-threat, returning to task. Duncan had seen that exact sequence only in people who had spent serious time in environments where every unexpected sound was run through a threat matrix before the body was permitted an emotional response. He began watching her differently after that. The way she positioned herself in the barn. She never stood with her back to the wide doors. When she was doing close work, checking Zeus's feet, measuring grain, she angled so the entrance stayed in her peripheral field. Duncan had a term for that habit. It was the kind of thing that got baked into a person after enough time working in places where inattention got people killed. He tried to reason himself out of it. Kerrville was not the Sierra Madre. Sage Alcott had a valid Texas employment card, a clean background check from the agency, and 6 years of references Brendan had verified personally. She was a ranch hand. She was good with horses. She had probably just worked rough places that made her watchful. He almost convinced himself. Then the storm came. The front moved through on a Saturday in late April, the sky going green-yellow in that particular way that meant rotating weather somewhere close. By 10 p.m., lightning was hitting within a mile, thunder continuous, rain horizontal against the barn siding. Duncan was in the house, with the lights off and his Glock on the nightstand, half watching the weather radar, half listening to the barn. Zeus hated storms. The original training accident, a rope, hardpan, 30 feet of drag, had left the horse with a violent phobia of close percussion. Lightning alone was manageable. Thunder at distance was manageable. But the combination of nearby strikes and wind hammering corrugated roofing was enough to send the stallion into what the vet described as a dissociative panic episode. He would throw himself against stall walls, strike with his front feet, make sounds that didn't belong to a horse. Duncan heard it start around 10:15, the hollow crash of Zeus slamming into the boards, the high, strangled sound of a horse beyond rational reach. He was already reaching for his cane when the barn door opened, and the lean silhouette of Sage Alcott stepped inside out of the rain. She'd been in the barn apartment above the tack room. He hadn't realized she was still on the property. She moved towards Zeus's stall without hesitation. The stallion was full-blown, wheeling in the small space, shod hooves throwing sparks off the concrete floor, whites of his eyes visible from the far end of the barn. Any experienced horse person knew what you did not do in that situation. You did not approach a panicked horse in a confined space without a route out. You waited, you talked low, you let the animal locate its own way back. Sage didn't wait. She went directly to the stall gate and stood there exactly 2 seconds. Then she raised her right hand to shoulder height and executed a specific, deliberate sequence. Fingers spread wide, palm forward, a slow pivot of the wrist until the palm rotated downward, then a single firm drop of the hand, straight toward the floor, fingers together, like a blade cutting air. Zeus stopped. Not gradually settled, stopped. All 4 feet on the floor, head dropping. The muscles across his hindquarters unclenched in a visible wave that ran from his withers to his tail. He breathed out in one long, shuddering gust and took 2 steps toward Sage. She unlatched the gate, slipped in beside him, pressed her palm against his neck, and talked low to him in a voice too quiet to carry. Duncan stood in the barn doorway with rain soaking through his shirt and did not move. He knew what that hand signal was. It was a cavalry-derived nonverbal command developed during the Mounted Operations Training Program at Fort Carson, a program that had been folded into a classified Special Operations Equine Integration curriculum and used by units that did not exist in any public record. The sequence, palm spread, wrist rotation, downward finish, meant halt and yield. It was designed for military horses in situations where sound discipline was critical, where a vocal command could compromise a position. It worked on a horse trained to that program and only to that program. Zeus had come out of CBP mounted unit. CBP mounted unit had cross-trained with at least one classified DoD equine program, and Sage Alcott, ranch hand, had known the exact signal without a moment's hesitation. Duncan did not go back to bed. The next morning, when Sage drove her clay-colored Ranger into town for supplies, he called the one person he still fully trusted, his former partner and closest friend, Vincent Holst. Vinny had been his number 2 on the task force for 6 years. He now worked private sector defense intelligence, consulting out of Denver, but he still had access to channels Duncan no longer did. "You look like something dragged you through a fence," Vinny said, when his face appeared on the encrypted video app, monitors glowing in the background of what looked like his Denver office. "I need a deep trace on someone, not an agency pull, the real thing." Duncan kept his voice low. "Name is Sage Alcott. She's working his brother's barn. She's not who she says she is." "You sure you're not just going sideways, Rael?" "The TBI makes you." "She used the cascade signal on my horse last night." Silence on the line. "The Fort Carson sequence?" "Exact." Zeus was in full panic. She dropped him in under 3 seconds. More silence, then the clicking of a mechanical keyboard. "Give me 2 hours." Duncan spent those 2 hours going through every interaction he'd had with Sage over the past 3 weeks. The way she handled Zeus's leg wraps, not ranch hand competent, something closer to field medic economical, in the way of someone who had dressed injuries under less forgiving conditions than a clean's stall. The way she'd looked at the fence line cameras on her first day, not with curiosity, with assessment. The way she had never once asked him about his injury or his cane, the reflexive question every stranger eventually asked. His phone buzzed. "Call me now." He dialed. "Talk to me, Vinny." "Sage Alcott is real." Holst's voice had changed, compact, measured. Employment history, tax records, credentials, all valid, but they materialized 34 months ago. Before that, the name doesn't exist in any system I can reach. Manufactured legend. A professional one. Whoever built it knew exactly what they were doing. I got a biometric partial before the system kicked me out. A unit designation, Echo Rider. DHS Special Programs, Rael. Those are the people who ran the dismantlement operation against the Fuentes network back in 2019. They don't have names. They don't have public faces. If she's Echo Rider, she is not in your barn to muck stalls. Duncan's hand tightened around the phone. Either she's there to finish what the cartel started, or she's there to keep you breathing while someone uses you to draw the network out. Vinny finished. Be careful. Don't tip her off. Give me 24 hours to pull more thread. Can you fly into San Antonio? I can get a flight out of Denver first thing tomorrow. Meet you somewhere neutral. Come here, Duncan said. I need someone I trust on the ground. I'll be there tomorrow morning. Don't do anything before then. The line dropped. Duncan stared at the wall. 12 hours. Sage returned from town at noon, unloaded feed bags from the truck bed, went about the afternoon routine as if the world were perfectly ordinary. Duncan watched her from the kitchen. He ate lunch without tasting it. He had spent his career reading bodies for concealed intent. Hers gave him nothing, which was itself a kind of information. At 2:30, she went up to the barn apartment. He moved. Not fast, the hip didn't allow it, but carefully. Sage kept a canvas field bag on a peg inside the tack room. He'd registered it as unremarkable every day for 3 weeks. He unhooked it now, set it on the satchel stand, and unzipped the main compartment. He expected personal items, a water bottle, a paperback. What he found: a meticulous field medical kit, tourniquet, quick clot packs, chest seals, a suture organizer in hard plastic. Beneath that, a compact satellite communication device, government issue by the proprietary connector, powered off. And at the bottom of the bag, in a custom foam insert, a Sig Sauer P365XL with suppressor-ready threading, loaded, safety on, spare magazine beside it. Next to the pistol lay a single folded paper, a topographic map of the area within 12 miles of the ranch, with 4 locations marked in red grease pencil and one marked with a small orange X. The orange X was the barn. The second stair from the bottom shifted under weight. That particular step, right side, the one Duncan had learned to avoid because it announced his presence every time. He looked up. Sage stood in the tack room doorway. She'd changed her boots. He hadn't heard her cross the yard. Her hands were empty, and her face wore the same composed express always did, except that the mild quality of it was entirely gone. What remained beneath it was something older and considerably more precise. Put it down carefully, she said. Her voice had dropped a register. Not threatening, factual, and step away from the bag. Duncan didn't move. He held her gaze. Who do you work for? You shouldn't have opened that. Who sent you? She held his eyes for a moment. Then something shifted in her expression. A decision being made. Step back from the bag and I'll answer you. If you reach under the saddle stand for the Ruger you've got taped there, this conversation ends in a way neither of us can afford. He had not told anyone about the Ruger. He stepped back. Sage crossed to the bag, rezipped it without looking at it, and hung it back on the peg. She turned to face him and put her hands in her pockets, which was a deliberate thing, reducing her threat posture, inviting him to stay in the conversation. My mandate is to keep you alive and mobile, she said. Echo Rider embedded me through the agency your brother hired. We've been tracking the financial network that funded the Vasquez Lorca ambush for 18 months before the operation even happened. When you survived, the network identified you as a liability. You can name the internal source. The mole, Duncan said. Yes. No softening around the word. You called Vincent Holst this morning. The room went very quiet. He's my partner. He's been my partner for 6 years. He landed in San Antonio last night, Sage said. He was in Denver 2 days ago. He is not in Denver now. I saw his office on the call, the monitors. A looped background feed, standard tradecraft. Her eyes stayed level with his. Holst didn't just run my biometrics this morning, Duncan. He flagged my presence to the network. Your call to him put a clock on this location. If he mobilized immediately after you hung up, we have less time than I'd like. Duncan heard himself say it before he'd finished believing it. You're telling me Vinny is the mole. He's been managing your recovery timeline since El Paso, Sage said quietly. Feeding the network your mobility status, the property layout, your security setup. He was the one who suggested your brother use a private staffing agency. He expected to control who was placed here. He didn't account for us placing someone first. A very small pause. The Vasquez Lorca network told him they had leverage on his daughter, that she was in danger unless he cooperated. Kara. Duncan's voice went flat. She's 23, she lives in Boulder. She's been in protective custody since March, Sage said. She's safe. She has been safe. The network used the threat to keep Holst compliant, but the threat itself was fabricated. He could have come to us at any point in the past 6 months. The silence between them had weight. Priscilla Ayres had a daughter, Duncan said. 7 months old when Priscilla deployed. He didn't say anything beyond that. He didn't need to. He set his weapon carefully on the saddle stand and looked away from Sage because his hands were shaking and it had nothing to do with nerve damage. How much time, he said. Sage checked her watch, a tactical timepiece, military spec, nothing a ranch hand would own. If he moved after your call, his contractors could reach this property within 2 hours, possibly less. She stepped to the tack room's narrow window and scanned the access road. We need the barn locked down. We need to not be in the open when they come through the gate. My brother is already being rerouted. We have people with him. She turned back. Can you hold a position? Yes. Then we use the center aisle. 2 choke points. Zeus stays in his stall until I give him a signal. Duncan almost produced something like a laugh. It came out considerably grimmer. You're planning around a horse. A 1,700-pound animal trained to cavalry standards who responds to my commands and has a documented history of injuring anyone who enters his space without permission, Sage said evenly. He's the most effective thing in this barn. She moved through the space with efficiency that made 3 weeks of quiet ranch work look like exactly what it had been, cover. She tripped a secondary latch on the main doors he hadn't known existed. She checked 2 small pressure sensors she had apparently installed under the entrance gravel. She attached something to the gap at the base of the far stall wall that turned out to be a piezo alarm wired to her watch. You retrofitted this entire barn, Duncan said. Week 1, she didn't offer an apology for it. He took position behind the heavy timber of the center divider with a clear angle down the main aisle. She moved to the far end near Zeus's stall and stood where the shadows pooled deepest. The stallion came to his gate and watched her with calm, absolute attention. They waited 40 minutes. The first pressure sensor triggered at 10:47. 3 contacts moving from the northeast, along the fence line where the cameras had the narrowest coverage. Sage's watch vibrated twice. She looked across the length of the barn at Duncan and held up 3 fingers. He nodded. The main doors came in hard, a hydraulic ram, the kind used by professional entry teams, not a kick. 3 men in tactical stack formation, weapon lights cutting the dark, expensive gear, disciplined movement, the kind of contract that had serious money behind it. The first man through the door stepped directly onto the pressure. Matt Sage had placed just inside the threshold. Zeus hit the stall gate so hard he tore 1 hinge out of the wood. The stallion came through the gap the way he'd come through every impossible thing in his life. Not panicked, but focused, which was a different and far more dangerous thing. The first contractor took the horse's shoulder at full charge and went down hard, weapons skittering across the concrete. The second man swung his light toward Zeus, and that was the direction away from Sage. She came out of the shadows at the far wall without a sound, moving at a pace that bore no resemblance to the woman who had quietly swept feed off stall floors for 3 weeks. The second contractor had 2 seconds of awareness before she made contact. A controlled strike to his weapon arm, a sweep, a takedown, and then she had his weapon and he was secured to a stall post before the third man had fully processed what was happening. Duncan covered the third from the center divider. Federal agent, down, now. The man looked at the stallion, still circling the first contractor, and made the reasonable calculation. He went to his knees. Duncan moved up the aisle, his left leg dragging on the concrete, the nerve firing through the hip, the pain doing what pain always did under stress, becoming noise he could work through. He kicked the third man's weapon clear and held position. From the access road, headlights, multiple vehicles, moving fast. Ours, Sage said from somewhere behind him, slightly out of breath. I triggered extraction when the sensor tripped. The barn doors opened properly this time, slow, flashlight pointed at the ceiling. 3 people in federal tactical gear swept through and began processing the scene with the quiet, practiced efficiency of people who had done this before and expected to do it again. Vincent Holst walked in last. He wasn't armed. His hands were raised to shoulder height. His face carried the expression of a man who had run all the calculations and arrived at a number he could no longer make work. Duncan. His voice came out rough. I need you to understand what they were threatening. They had Kara. They told me they had Kara and I. Kara is in a protected location in Colorado, Duncan said. She's been there since March. Vinny's eyes went somewhere that wasn't the barn. The network told you the threat was real to ensure your continued cooperation, Sage said. She stood slightly behind Duncan's right shoulder, her voice carrying that same unflinching factual quality it always had. You had options. At any point in 6 months, you had options. You chose not to use them. The thing on Vinny's face now wasn't fear. It was harder to look at than fear. It was the face of someone who understood, for the first time, the full shape of what they had done and could not fit it back inside the story they had been telling themselves. Priscilla Ayers had a daughter, Duncan said. She was 7 months old. He handed his weapon to the closest federal agent because his hands were doing something he couldn't stop, and he turned away from Vinny and walked to the far end of the barn. He stood with his back against the stall boards and looked at Zeus. The stallion had returned to his gate. He hung his big copper-red head over the rail and regarded Duncan with the patient, unhurried attention that horses gave the people they had decided to accept. Behind Duncan, Vincent Holst was being read his rights in a quiet, official voice. Equipment was being photographed and logged. Someone was on a radio coordinating the transport. Sage appeared beside him. The field bag was back over her shoulder. She looked like what she was, someone who had been doing hard, precise, dangerous work for a very long time, and who was tired in a way that a night's sleep would not address. You read it correctly, she said after a moment. From the first week, you knew something was wrong with me. I just couldn't figure out which kind of wrong. That's the job, she said simply. Zeus stretched his neck over the gate and breathed warm air against Duncan's palm. The same exhale he'd given Sage the night of the storm, the one Duncan had recognized instantly as something reserved for very few people. A permission, a judgment rendered in the only language the horse had ever trusted. Duncan put his hand flat against the stallion's nose. Your debrief team is going to want a full accounting, Sage said. Timeline, all of it. The U.S. Attorney's Office has been holding a sealed indictment contingent on tonight. I know how it works. She nodded once, started to move toward the barn doors and the business waiting there, then stopped. For what it's worth, she said without turning around, Zeus has good judgment. Duncan looked at the horse. Yeah, he said, better than mine. He pushed himself off the stall boards, left leg finding the floor, and walked toward the light.